Tonight we're going to be talking about the Antebellum Reform era. This is what your paper slide video will be about. So the first question we have is, what does the word antebellum mean? Well, the first part of the word means before, ante, A-N-T-E. The second part of the word means something associated with war, B-E-L-L. So put those two words together and what do we get? Before the war. So when we're talking about the antebellum period, we're talking about things that happened before the Civil War. You can use those two prefixes and suffixes whenever you see anything that has A-N-T, you know it's before. And whenever you see something with B-E-L-L, like bellicose, belligerent, you know it has to do with fighting or war. So, the antebellum period is the time period before the Civil War. We characterize that as beginning roughly 1820s through about 1850s. During this time, there are many reform movements that happen. Reform means change. All of this change sparks with something called the Second Great Awakening, or a religious revival. During the Second Great Awakening, a very famous minister named Charles Finney went around the country preaching to people that everyone is equal and that everyone could go to heaven if they were baptized and had a religious conversion. They could be accepted into the kingdom of heaven. Now, this was new to many people throughout the nation, and blacks and women were also invited to the meetings that he held. If you have ever heard of something called a revival or a tent revival, Charles Finney would host these large tent revivals, and women and African American slaves were invited and allowed to attend. Now, if you are a woman and you're hearing Charles Finney talking about equality, you're going to say, well, then why am I property of my husband? Why can't I vote? If you are a slave and you hear about the Second Great Awakening and Charles Finney's speeches, you're going to wonder, well, why am I enslaved if I'm equal to my brother? If there's equality in Christ, then why am I a slave? So the Second Great Awakening, this religious revival, spurs tons of different reform movements. And we're going to talk about some of them today and learn some of the major words associated with these reform movements. One of the first movements is the abolition movement, which tried to change our nation's slave culture by getting rid of the practice of slavery altogether. The women's rights movement came out of the Second Great Awakening, in which women fought for suffrage, or the right to vote. The temperance movement, in which many people advocated for the complete abstinence, or for people to stop altogether using alcohol. And then Mormonism, which was a religion that grew during the antebellum period, and the leaders were eventually pushed westward. Tomorrow in your PowerPoint, you'll learn more about the Mormon religion. So let's talk about some important words that you need to know in order to understand the reform movements of the antebellum period. The first word is abolition, or to get rid of. In this case, we're talking about slavery. So to remember that, we have chains here being broken. The second word is suffrage, or the right to vote. Suffrage, when you look at that word, you might initially think suffering. But when we're talking about women's suffrage during this unit, we're talking about the right to vote. Temperance, to abstain or to totally stop drinking alcohol. During this time period, people believe that drinking alcohol, just one sip, would lead to alcoholism and would be the downfall of American culture. Transcendentalism was a spiritual doctrine that emerged during this time period, in which people believed that they could experience God through nature. So you can see people in this picture looking at the trees and the clouds and getting away from the formal traditions of a church and really using nature to understand themselves and religion. And the last word that you'll need to understand is the word utopia. Utopia means a perfect society. So you can see I have these houses that look all the same, they're smiley faces, and just happiness. So during this time period, many people tried to create a utopian society. Now, you have some questions on ECHO that you need to answer, and tomorrow we're going to jump into the specifics of all of these reform movements and the major players and major events in each one. Have a good evening.